Few maritime disasters have captured the public imagination like the RMS Titanic. Perhaps it's because of the relatively recent nature of its sinking compared to the loss of something like the Mary Rose warship. The countless films, documentaries and exhibitions probably help in prolonging the fascination, while new theories and reconstructions attempt to pin blame on one factor or another as the reason the ship sank. But as we're focused on folklore and legends here, what legends or ghost stories have become attached to RMS Titanic? Why are people convinced that ghosts still linger in the wreckage, or that a cursed mummy is to blame for the disaster? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. Wow, I didn't think my voice would actually go that deep, but never mind. Happy winter solstice for my compatriots in the Northern Hemisphere, and happy summer solstice for any listeners in the Southern Hemisphere. Obviously, I'm in the Northern Hemisphere, and today is probably, I'm going to hazard a guess, actually my favourite day of the year, purely because after today we will start getting a few extra minutes of daylight per day. And considering at the moment I go out in the dark and I come home in the dark, when on those days I do go to my day job, that is going to be really quite welcome. Obviously, there are various different things that you can do to celebrate the winter solstice. It's quite difficult to actually find any historical records. And the general consensus is there was probably some kind of feasting going on. So I would imagine that anyone who might have been able to write was probably a bit too busy to write down what they were doing. So it's very difficult to know what people would have done in the ancient past about this. So I reckon you can just pretty much make up what seems like a good thing for you. And at least the one advantage that you've got is if you do want to wake up to see the sunrise, it's much easier to do on the winter solstice than it is the summer solstice. But anyway, let's continue with this month's theme. Now, I had a devil of a time trying to come up with something for this week, and I had all kinds of things on my list, from sunken treasure to other sea monsters that I might be able to come up with, and loads of other things we could have a look at. It started to prove a little bit difficult to actually find examples of certain things, and I thought, well, hang on, somebody actually asked for underwater ghosts. So I just put haunted shipwreck in Google, and the first response I got was the Titanic. And I was like, oh my god, how have I never done the Titanic yet? There is one particular story that we will be having a look at, which explains why I'm surprised I haven't actually done it yet. But I thought this one, not all of the stories actually relate to things underwater, but because the story doesn't work without the wreckage being underwater, I thought, you know what, I'm just going to sneak it in here. So there we go. Which does mean that next week will be the Loch Ness Monster, for those of you who are excited about that one. So let's have a look at the Titanic. Now, just on the extreme outside chance that anyone needs a refresher, let's take an extremely brief look at its history. Now, it was built in Belfast by Holland and Wolff for the White Star Line, and RMS Titanic set sail on her maiden voyage to New York on 10th of April 1912, and she carried around 2,240 passengers and crew. You do see different numbers stated, and I think it would be impossible to ever actually know exactly how many people were on board, but that's the general number that I kept coming across. Now, there was one myth that I wanted to bust straight away, and that's nobody ever actually advertised RMS Titanic as unsinkable. That actually came from an exclamation in Shipbuilder magazine that the bulkheads design made these Olympic liners practically unsinkable. So it's not actually something that they ever actually said about themselves. And people also point to the Titanic's relative lack of lifeboats, but again, that is actually another myth, because Titanic did actually carry more lifeboats than the British Board of Trade required them to have. So while it still wasn't enough, they still had more than they were supposed to have. So it's one of these things where language can be really slippery, and it's easy for people to look at something in a certain way and adopt a particular perspective purely because of the way something's been worded. But anyway, that's a side issue. As Titanic left the dock at Southampton, she almost collided with the SS New York, and some consider this a bad omen for a ship's maiden voyage. Eventually, Titanic struck an iceberg during its crossing late on 14th of April 1912, and I'm not going to go into the ship's failings because that lies beyond the scope of this podcast, and quite honestly, you can't really move online without finding a documentary about it somewhere, so we're not going to look at that. But the ship sank in the early hours on 15th of April 1912, and around 1,500 people lost their lives, and only 706 people survived. The remains of the ship now rest on the sea floor some 2.5 miles beneath the surface, and nobody actually located the wreck until 1985, and it actually lies some 400 miles east of Newfoundland. But we're going to start off with the main story I wanted to look at, because why not? And that is the cursed mummy of the Princess of Amun-Ra. And I remember coming across this story actually surprisingly late, and I think it was because I'd gotten really sort of fascinated by the idea of the British Museum tube station being haunted, and the idea that there was an Egyptian mummy ghost running around in the bowels of the station, because there's supposed to be this secret tunnel that led from the tube up to the museum, and somehow the ghost had discovered it and used to like potter about on the tube, you know, the way that you do. And I came across this story at that point, and I remember going, oh my god, that's just daft. And obviously then discovered a little bit more about it, which is what we're going to do now. So I will tell you the story first, and then we'll actually dig into it a bit. So according to this particular legend, the mummy of the Princess of Amun-Ra was on board the Titanic when she set sail, and it was so cursed, so said this story, that the Titanic's fate was inevitable. So we have to go back to the 1890s, where 4 young Englishmen encounter a rather beautiful sarcophagus containing the remains of the princess while they're in Luxor, and they have a situation where they're drawing lots to decide which one actually gets to buy her, and they eventually do buy the coffin, and each of the 4 men then meets with some kind of misfortune. You've got one of them gets shot in the arm accidentally, and then their arm needs to be amputated. Somebody else walks into the desert and never returns. Somebody else's bank goes bust and they lose their entire life savings, and the 4th one loses his job and can then only earn a living selling matches. So after further accidents, the coffin ended up in the British Museum, where cleaners and watchmen also met painful or tragic ends when they were somewhere near the coffin. Apparently a visitor once flicked a cloth at the face of the mummy, and his child died of measles some weeks later. The managers eventually moved the princess to the basement in a vain attempt to try and stop these things from happening, but then they sold her to a private collector after yet more misfortune, even after the mummy's move. Finally, an American archaeologist bought it and arranged for it to travel to New York with him in April 1912, and the rest, as you might imagine, would be history. However, none of it's true. And anyone who's been with me for a while and is aware of the hallmarks of particularly urban legends will have already spotted a few clues. The names are a major clue, or the lack thereof. The only real name that we actually have that you would recognise is the British Museum. None of the 4 young Englishmen are named. And the Princess of Amun-Ra is also a massive problem, because the British Museum have never had a mummy called the Princess of Amun-Ra. They actually had a coffin lid from the priestess of Amun, which is still in their collection. But Amun-Ra is one of ancient Egypt's best recorded gods, as the supreme sun god and god of the universe. So the name Princess of Amun-Ra actually makes very little sense, because Amun-Ra is not a place. And instead the name then slots into the Egyptomania that swept Europe in the 19th century. So priestess of Amun, yes, she was a priestess of this particular god, but the princess, no, doesn't actually make sense. But this same Egyptomania is why you find sphinxes and pyramids and obelisks in the Victorian cemeteries, and why Highgate Cemetery in particular has an Egyptian avenue. There's no other reason for it to be there. The legend also sees one of the mummy's owners consulting Madame Blavatsky for her help in exorcising the spirit, and she replies it's so evil that it cannot be exorcised, so they're better off getting rid of it. Except the mummy doesn't end up in London until the late 1890s, and Madame Blavatsky died in 1891, so clearly that didn't happen either. And the very fact is, I say, that nobody involved with this story, we don't know who the archaeologist was, the managers are all nameless, none of them have names, and that's usually quite a good indication that this particular story is nonsense. So where did the story actually come from? Well, this bit's actually quite an interesting part of the legend, because it came from William Stead and Douglas Murray, 2 Englishmen who then created a story about an evil mummy. Stead was a journalist and editor, as well as a believer in spiritualism. It's unclear why they concocted the story, but it only became linked with the Titanic after Stead died in the disaster. So he had told the story at dinner, and a survivor then recounted it to the New York World once they were then in New York. Someone somehow put Stead's story and his presence on the ship together, and then erroneously deduced that the cursed mummy in question must also be on the ship as well. Now, I did actually find one newspaper article from 1956 that reported the cursed mummy story as being a fact. However, even as far back as 1927, people understood that the story was not quite a hoax, because it's not an indication that somebody told it on purpose for it to end up being blamed for what happened. It's more just an unfortunate conflation of two separate things. But it isn't a faithful explanation of what happened either. And an article in the Gloucester Citizen noted that Howard Carter himself dismissed tales of Egyptian curses and I quote, childish inventions, end quote, when they were resurrecting the cursed mummy of the British Museum story. And obviously again in 1927, there was quite a lot of Egyptomania still going on after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. Now, the writer of that article noted that the story, and I quote, must have tickled the trustees of the museum, end quote, before pointing out that the cursed mummy was actually still in the museum. Obviously, it's not. It is just the coffin lid, so there isn't actually even a mummy to go with it in the British Museum. Now, not everyone was so matter-of-fact. One news article in 1914 even claimed that the British Museum created an exact replica of the coffin lid, and once that was on display rather than the original, the complaints of weird activity stopped. Now, in this version of the story, the museum sold it to an American collector so he wouldn't expose the one on display as a fake. And that one kind of wanders off into conspiracy theory territory very, very quickly. Now, experts actually combed through the cargo manifest in 1985 and found no evidence of a mummy whatsoever, yet the 1914 news article even attempted to explain away its absence from official paperwork in a manner befitting a true conspiracy theorist, because they claimed that, and I quote, it was carefully packed so that no one could guess what its covering case contained, and arrangements were made so that no hitch would be caused by customs house examinations, end quote. Now, they don't actually explain why such efforts would have been necessary in the first place, but no excavations of the wreck site have ever revealed an Egyptian coffin or a coffin lid, and considering the incredibly mundane items that have been retrieved and put on display, you would certainly notice a sarcophagus among them. But I absolutely love that story, even if it is a complete and utter myth. But no, the Titanic was not sunk by a cursed mummy. But we are going to go on to the next set of stories that have accrued around this particular disaster, and that's the idea of the ghost of Captain Smith. Now, we have talked about crisis apparitions before, which is when a person sees an image of a loved one either at the point of their death or just before, while the loved one is actually far away. Often they don't know that anything's happened to the person at the point that they see them, and it only makes sense later. And one Titanic legend claimed that Captain Edward Smith's wife Sarah saw the captain as a ghost well before she received word that the ship had gone down. Now, it's not the only time someone has seen Captain Smith. In 1977, Second Officer Leonard Bishop of the SS Winterhaven gave a tour of the vessel to a soft-spoken British passenger. Bishop later reported the passenger as being unusual, but he couldn't specify how. Eventually, Bishop came across a photo of Captain Smith, and Bishop exclaimed that this was the strange passenger that he'd taken on the tour of his boat. And he only learned from his companion that Captain Smith had gone down with the Titanic. He does get about a bit as well, I should say, because he's also been spotted at his childhood home in Stoke-on-Trent. A retired mariner claimed to have seen Captain Smith at different sites in Baltimore over a 17-year period, although it should be pointed out that this mariner was actually suffering from eye and brain cancer at the time. And one family also thought that he'd popped up in the background of a photo taken in a Belfast bar. I have seen said photo because it is actually in a newspaper article that is online, and you can find the link in the blog post that this episode is attached to, and it is literally just a blur behind them. I've no idea how anyone even saw a person in it, let alone Captain Smith. But I can't help thinking that it's unlikely that he would appear in so many places. But I think at the same time, he's incredibly distinctive to look at. Like, he's quite recognisable, so it would make him a lot easier for someone to spot among anyone else among the crew, which probably explains why people see him purely because he's familiar. Although that does suggest that people might see ghosts of the rest of the crew, but they just don't realise that they're ghosts, because it is possible. And as for ghosts, I did want to know, are there actually any underwater ghosts associated with the Titanic? And surprisingly, there appear to be. Ships passing the disaster site have reported seeing orbs of light above the water, and when they have been spotted, they tend to appear in clusters. Now, given orbs in ghost hunting TV shows are often either light reflecting off insects or moisture in the air, which is why they're often only detectable on camera, orbs at sea would be far more intriguing, especially if they're seen with the naked eye, because there wouldn't really be anything above the water for light to bounce off. So that one's quite an interesting one. But even weirder, submarines also report strange signals or radio interference if they're near the disaster site. And SOS messages with no actual source also crop up, which isn't surprising since Titanic was an early adopter of the SOS distress signal. The Titanic Museum in Branson, Missouri is believed to be haunted, and it displays more than 400 artefacts directly from the ship and its passengers, and it seems that people think the souls of the dead cling to their items even now. However, the Titanic Museum in Belfast is not considered haunted, potentially since it's intended as a tribute rather than displaying items from a gravesite. I remember when there was the Titanic exhibition at the O2 in London, and this would have been about 2011, I think, and you could go around and obviously have a look at all these things that they brought up. And I remember there was a case of perfume that had somehow survived, and you could actually smell the perfume in the case, and it was absolutely amazing. And I remember feeling a bit odd around a lot of the items, particularly the things that had never been used, but I couldn't help feeling that that was more just a sense of sadness about the disaster. And they did also lower the temperature in each room that you went in the closer you got to the iceberg, so that you'd get a sense of obviously how cold it would be to be around an iceberg. So it is, I suppose, possible that people have been sensing the change in temperature and ascribing that to something else. But there again, who knows? Maybe people have been having haunted experiences in that particular museum. But what do we make of these myths about RMS Titanic? Well, given the sheer number of disasters at sea since humans figured out how to make boats, you could imagine the sea as being teeming with ghosts, because you've got drowned sailors and passengers, not to mention those lost during sea battles and accidents. With no proper burial, these spirits should, in theory, wander the world's oceans like ectoplasmic flotsam and jetsam. Even when we don't get underwater ghosts, we do get legends of ghost ships, like the Flying Dutchman. Now, bearing all of this in mind, the idea of ghosts associated with Titanic's wreckage is almost inevitable. Sightings on land are less easy to explain, although, like I say, the relative celebrity of Titanic could inspire people to claim some kind of association with it. Plenty of myths already surround the ship and its construction, with experts still at odds over exactly what happened on that fateful trip. Yet other myths, like the presence of a cursed mummy, persist, even when we know they're untrue. Perhaps we'd rather believe in cursed objects as the cause of a disaster, rather than just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. A cursed explanation somehow feels less scary than good old-fashioned coincidence or just random chaos. So please do feel free to tell me what you think. Do you think that things like wreckage sites and so on would be haunted? Do you think that we should actually just leave them alone as a result? I must admit, I'm in that category, that these are essentially graves, probably should leave them alone. And yeah, let me know what you think. We are, of course, going to have a look at the Loch Ness Monster next week. And this is going to be my only concession to the festive period, because obviously the big day is on Wednesday. So if you are celebrating Christmas, I do hope that you have an absolutely fabulous day. Even if you decide not to do any of the traditional stuff that society expects you to do, I hope that you have a nice day anyway. I do hope that you enjoy the solstice though, because that's like a day of astronomical significance. And whether you're celebrating winter or summer solstice doesn't really matter. I hope that you have a good one. But I will see you next week for our final episode of 2024. And can you believe that the podcast is going to be like 6 in January? It's absolutely wild to think of that. So for anyone who's been here since the beginning, my God, you have staying power, and I salute you. I really do. But anyway, have a marvellous week ahead. If anybody is like on their own or is in a group of people and they'd rather be on their own and basically want someone to chat to, like last year, I will be around on Instagram and Blue Sky sort of periodically throughout the day. Please do feel free to drop us a message, send us a meme. We can exchange gifts if you want. I'm not really bothered, but it's just if you want someone to chat to, potentially about folklore rather than whatever drosses on the telly, then as I say, I am at your disposal. So if I can help anyone feel a bit less alone or basically feel like you've got someone you'd rather talk to, then I am there. But otherwise, as I say, have a marvellous week ahead, whatever you end up doing. And I will see you next week when we're going to finally encounter the Loch Ness Monster. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hoped you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.